Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight we're headed somewhere sacred, somewhere heroic, somewhere that smells faintly of goat sweat, crushed olives, and lightly sunburned masculinity. Olympia, 5th century BCE, where the finest male specimens of the Greek world gather to wrestle, race, punch, and occasionally die, all for the thrilling reward of a slightly fancier salad garnish. You are not one of these specimens. You are a moderately fit citizen from a polis no one can pronounce, with delusions of grandeur and deeply misplaced confidence in your calf strength. You have entered the Olympic Games. You will not be entering again. Before we begin this slow descent into oiled chests, public failure, and fig-based moral lessons, do me one small favour. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's so fun to see who's tuning in from around the world. If you prefer these stories without ads, you can join the Patreon. It's linked in the description. And if you're listening in bed, consider curling up with an absurdly soft blanket. The kind that feels like being gently embraced by a cloud. I've linked the one I use in the description. Now, lie back, get comfortable, let's begin. You hear about the games the same way you hear most things in your polis, from an old man yelling near the fountain and a younger man trying to sell sandals with the words Olympia or bust scratched into the soles. At first you laugh, then disturbingly you don't. Something about the idea lingers. You are not, by any accepted measure, an athlete. You are a citizen, a modestly toned, occasionally winded, olive-pitting, goat-chasing citizen. You once wrestled your cousin into a puddle during the solstice festival and have spent the last 5 years referring to it as that time I won a match. Still, there's something about the idea of Olympia, the sacred grounds, the drums, the spectators shouting names they can't pronounce, that speaks to the lesser-known but deeply powerful muscle at the base of every Greek man's spine, his ego. You begin to wonder, not should I go, but what event would I win? This is, by any rational measure, an insane question. You haven't run more than a few paces since the wine merchant's cart hit your chicken. You haven't punched anything besides a fig tree, and even that ended poorly. But none of this matters. Logic is for philosophers. You are chasing glory. And so begins your period of training, a word you use very loosely. You start your mornings by stretching in dramatic ways that feel important, but mostly just attract stares from the baker's daughter. You jog around the outskirts of the agora twice, wheezing audibly by the time you pass the olive press. You splash water on your face and call it sweat. You do not lift weights, partly because you have none, but mostly because your neighbour borrowed your practice stones and used them to hold down roofing tiles. When you ask for them back, he pretends not to hear you. This, you decide, is a test of your mental discipline. To prove your commitment, you also give up cheese. Not because you're instructed to, no one has asked you to do anything really, but because you once heard a man say, athletes avoid it before competitions. You don't remember why, possibly something about bloating or sin. Either way, it seems like the kind of ascetic sacrifice a champion would make. You announce this abstention loudly at the taverna. No one cares. A visiting merchant offers you a honey cake. You sniff it suspiciously for dairy content, then decline with what you believe to be a noble grimace. The merchant shrugs and gives it to someone more deserving, namely, a stray dog. Each evening you jog in circles in the field, behind your cousin's house, often while yelling affirmations like, speed is a state of mind, and pain is temporary, but victory is engraved. The goats are unimpressed. Your cousin is less so, especially when you accidentally kick over his laundry stand during a poorly timed sprint. Your thighs cramp. You limp home, muttering something about overtraining. Your mother asks if you've joined a cult. You tell her it's worse. You've decided to compete in the Olympics. She does not take this seriously, which is fair. She also does not stop you, which is less fair. She simply nods, pats you on the head in a way that implies both affection and skepticism, and returns to trimming the grapevine. You interpret this as approval. Your friends are less subtle. One asks if this is like the time you tried to become a poet after 3 verses and a dream about a turtle. Another suggests you might be better suited to Olympic commentary, perhaps yelling encouraging things from the sidelines like, "Don't die," or "nice ankles." A third simply groans into his wine cup and refuses to make eye contact until the topic changes. This you take as jealousy. You begin fashioning what you call a training tunic out of a thinner, more breathable fabric, despite the fact that the Olympics are famously performed in the nude. You justify this by saying it helps with airflow. No one asks. You spend an entire afternoon oiling your arms and practicing poses in front of your neighbour's reflective urn. It's not your urn. She tells you to stop doing that. You don't. As the idea solidifies into reality, or at least delusion with a strong sense of direction, you start telling strangers about your upcoming departure. You don't have a plan yet, or sandals that fit properly, but you speak with the certainty of a man already halfway to immortality. You declare your intentions to the fishmonger, who grunts. You explain your discipline, still undecided, to the priest at the Temple of Apollo, who tells you to sacrifice something small, like expectations. You even mention it to the bronze smith, who gives you a long, speculative look, and then offers to make you a tooth straightener in advance. You write your name on a small piece of parchment and toss it into a ceremonial fire, hoping it will impress Zeus. The fire goes out. You blame the wind. The elders of your village begin to mutter. This is not unusual. They mutter about everything. But now their muttering takes on a slightly sharper edge, something between civic embarrassment and mild amusement. One says your ambition reminds him of Icarus. Another says you remind him more of Icarus's donkey. You do not ask what that means. You assume it's a compliment. To further cement your seriousness, you commission a small wooden javelin from the carpenter's apprentice. It arrives splintered and vaguely spoon-shaped. You use it anyway. You practice throwing it in the early morning light, striking weeds, bushes, and once, tragically, a basket of bread. The baker is not pleased. You apologize. You also offer him a fig. He declines with what can only be described as polite contempt. As the days pass, your confidence grows in inverse proportion to your coordination. You attempt to practice long jumping by hurling yourself from low walls, often landing in sand, sometimes in puddles, once in a sleeping chicken. You wrestle a sack of grain until it rips. You punch a column, which was a mistake. You blame the column. You spend one memorable afternoon debating which event will best showcase your natural talents, which you describe as tenacity, lung capacity, and strategic flailing. You eliminate the chariot race immediately, as you do not own a horse and the local stable master once referred to you as the one who smells like figs. The javelin seems promising until you remember your shoulder clicks ominously when rotated. You briefly consider the discus, but your aim has been described as dangerously interpretive. This leaves the foot race simple, pure, and impossible to misinterpret. You practice by chasing a child who stole your cloak. You do not catch him. You begin telling people you are Olympic bound. You say it with the gravitas of a seasoned champion, while rubbing your thigh and wincing slightly. When someone asks which polis you'll be representing, you give the name of yours, then immediately explain where it is because no one has heard of it. Someone asks what your strategy will be. You say, victory. Then you cough because you weren't expecting a follow-up question. Your final step before departure is to make a sacrifice at the local shrine, something humble but meaningful. You offer a small clay figurine of Heracles that you painted yourself in what can only be described as ambitious colours. The priest accepts it with a sigh. You ask for a blessing. He says, "May you be remembered." You do not ask in what way. And then at last the moment arrives. You stand in the village square, hands on hips, posture heroic, chest oiled just a touch too enthusiastically. You announce that you're going to Olympia. Not as a spectator, not as a vendor, not as a man who accidentally wandered into the procession, looking for free olives. No, you are going as an athlete, a competitor, a symbol of your polis's forgotten potential. You wait for applause, you receive the sound of a donkey sneezing. Still no one stops you, and that, you decide, is as good as an endorsement. The morning after your grand announcement, the village elders reluctantly agree to organise a modest send-off in your honour, or at least in recognition of your inevitable absence. It's unclear whether the gesture is one of celebration or insurance. Either way, someone digs out the ceremonial wine jug. The good tablecloth is aired out over the altar, and your uncle begins fattening a goat with great enthusiasm. You hear him mutter something about finally making use of that nonsense beard, which you choose to interpret as support. Preparations unfold with the slightly chaotic air of a festival planned by people hoping it gets cancelled. The priest, a man with theatrical hands and a voice like a temple bell stuck in a wine jar, insists on crafting a prayer that truly honours the moment. By midday, he's still reciting it aloud to his sandals, occasionally pausing to sip diluted wine and rearrange verbs. You offer to help. He says you can contribute spiritually by moving some benches. You do. Poorly. Meanwhile, your mother has taken it upon herself to prepare figs, not just any figs, but her ceremonial ones, which involves soaking them in something that smells like vinegar and regret. She offers them with the same expression she once used when showing off your childhood drawings. Proud, hopeful, and slightly resigned to disappointment. You accept one and eat it slowly, chewing as though it's part of a ritual. It isn't. It's just a very sour fig. By sundown, the feast is underway. Your uncle has roasted the goat to a shade somewhere between sacrificial perfection and slightly alarmed shoe leather. The villagers gather in loose clumps, seated on crates, stones, and one upturned wash tub. A boy plays the lyre with enthusiasm but questionable timing. The flute girl from the market, who once saw you fall into a grain bin and has never let you forget it, arrives wearing too much confidence and not enough flute etiquette. She plays anyway, loudly. The food is simple but generous. Olives by the basket, roasted barley flatbread stacked like tiles, a pot of lentils that you believe contains at least one pebble, and several amphorae of wine that are mostly grape-based, probably. There is, pointedly, no cheese. You made a public declaration of cheese abstinence 2 weeks ago, and now everyone is pretending this is normal. The village cheese merchant, who has never forgiven you for saying his rennet smelled like betrayal, refuses to attend. You sit at the central table, or what passes for it, flanked by relatives who've already begun arguing over which event they'll claim you competed in, assuming you survive long enough to return. One suggests the chariot race, another says wrestling suits your build, which you think is a compliment until she clarifies that you have a very sturdy neck. Your cousin bets a clay coin on you, placing third in anything not involving aim. You smile, half from pride, half from wine. The priest finally begins his speech, having apparently decided that an epic tone requires shouting. He opens by comparing your journey to that of Odysseus, though his version of the Odyssey involves less shipwreck and more self-inflicted cramping. He calls you a symbol of civic fortitude, which is generous, and a reminder that effort is more important than outcome, which is not. You bow politely as he waves his hands in what appears to be a mixture of benediction and exasperation. Someone sneezes during the final blessing. You assume that's Zeus confirming receipt. As the fire crackles and the wine flows, the mood shifts from polite skepticism to full-on folk optimism. A shepherd insists you'll bring honour to the village. You don't recognise him. A woman you went to school with tells you she always knew you were destined for something involving running, or maybe shouting. A child tries to balance a fig on your head. You don't stop him. It falls off and lands in your cup. You drink it anyway. Halfway through the night, the flute girl approaches your table with a sly smile and asks if you're planning to sacrifice dignity to Zeus as well as your joints. You laugh too hard, partly because it's funny, partly because you're trying to chew and breathe at the same time. You attempt a clever reply, but it comes out as a hiccup and a vague choking noise. She pats your back like a slightly disappointed aunt and moves on. Someone hands you a second fig. It is handed to you solemnly, with both hands, as though it contains your future. You accept it with equal gravity, nodding like a man who understands the symbolism of fruit. You do not. You tuck it into your tunic pocket, where it immediately squishes. Later, as the wine loosens everyone's tongues, stories begin to flow, mostly about former Olympians from the village who may or may not have existed. One man claims his great-uncle once wrestled a Spartan using only his left hand. Another swears his cousin ran a foot race backward and still placed second. You nod and say, "Remarkable," at regular intervals. The stories grow more elaborate, more heroic, and suspiciously less anatomically plausible. By the time the moon is high, you've removed your sandals, someone's draped a garland around your neck that smells faintly of onions, and the lyre player has moved on to experimental fingering. You're warm, full, dizzy, and entirely convinced you're already halfway to victory. A group begins chanting your name. They get it wrong on the second syllable, but you don't correct them. It feels close enough. Your uncle raises a final toast, slurring slightly, declaring you the pride of the grain district, and maybe even the lower fountain quarter. The villagers cheer. You raise your cup, then lower it quickly, because you've spilled wine on your knee. Someone pats your back. Someone else tries to lift you in celebration, and immediately gives up. You shout something about bringing back the laurel, and the crowd whoops in vague support. You are, by this point, deeply invested in your own myth, and then, inevitably, you fall asleep. Not gracefully, not in your bed, not even on a bench. You drift sideways during an especially long flute solo, and slide neatly beneath the main table, where the ground is cool and smells faintly of spilled wine, goat fat and anticipation. Someone tosses a cloak over your legs. Another person adds a handful of leaves, for reasons known only to them. You mumble something about glory. A nearby dog licks your foot. Your dreams are vivid and deeply confusing. You stand at the top of a marble podium, wearing a crown of figs surrounded by cheering statues. Your muscles are enormous. Your hair is made of olive branches. The king of Sparta claps politely, while you deliver a monologue about civic pride and calf strength. Zeus nods from a nearby thundercloud. Then the floor collapses and you fall into a vat of oil. You wake just before dawn, groggy, aching, and covered in a film of something that may or may not be from the fig pocket. Your head throbs. Your ankle is bruised from an unknown source. Someone has written "champion" on your arm in charcoal. Your breath smells like roasted goat. You sit up slowly and realize that at some point during the night, someone must have oiled your shoulders, whether as a joke, a blessing, or a misguided preparation ritual. You may never know. Your mother is already sweeping the plaza. She steps over your legs without comment. You're not sure what hurts more, your temples or your dignity. You get to your feet, you wobble, you squint into the early light and say aloud, to no one in particular, "I am ready." No one answers, which, as before, you take as approval. You set off with a borrowed cloak and a small bundle of travel supplies, one spare tunic, a half loaf of barley bread, 2 figs, both mildly squashed, a dented water flask, and a note from your mother that reads, "Don't chase any goats, you're not faster than them." There's also a lump of resin you can't identify, but keep for spiritual reasons. You tuck it into the folds of your tunic, like a lucky charm. You will forget about it within the hour. The path out of your polis is mostly loose gravel, scattered poultry, and people pretending not to know you. You pass the marketplace, the temple steps, and the olive press where you once got your arm stuck trying to impress a potter's apprentice. A few neighbours wave as you go. One throws a stale date. You catch it, eat it, and pretend it's an omen. The road quickly turns from familiar to unpleasant. The sun rises faster than expected. Your cloak is too short to shade your neck, and the sandals you confidently declared training ready begin to betray you. By the second mile, your left sandal has lost its strap, and the right has developed a dramatic squeak. You try to swap them, then trip over your own foot. The gravel is sharp. You pretend the fall was intentional. There is no audience to believe you. At a bend in the road near a fig orchard, you encounter a cart. It's pulled by a mule with visible self-esteem issues and occupied by two men who look like they've never lost a fight and deeply resent the possibility of ever doing so. One nods at you, the other cracks his knuckles and then his neck, and then, just for variety, his toes. They are wrestlers, they explain, headed to Olympia to reclaim Thebes' honour. You say you didn't know Thebes had lost it. They both glare. You sit quietly on a bag of turnips and promise not to speak again. The cart ride is marginally better than walking, in the same way that being stung by one bee is marginally better than being stung by two. The mule stops frequently to mourn something invisible. The road turns to dust, then to mud, then to something you politely call puddle terrain. The wrestlers argue for 3 hours about whether neck width correlates with moral integrity. You attempt to sleep but are jostled awake each time the cart hits a root or a philosophical impasse. By midday, you've eaten both your figs and part of your left sleeve. When the cart breaks a wheel on a particularly judgmental-looking rock, you take it as a sign. You thank the wrestlers, who do not thank you back, and begin walking again. The sun is directly overhead now, which means your shadow is short. Your sweat is abundant, and your temper is quietly fraying. You attempt to sing for motivation, but your throat is dry and your lyrics mostly consist of left foot, don't cramp. Somewhere near the riverbank, you make your first navigational error. What appears to be a safe crossing is, in fact, a marsh. Your sandals are immediately consumed by muck. You flail dramatically, lose your balance, and topple forward with a splash that alarms nearby frogs. A heron watches in silence. You emerge covered in silt, one fig leaf stuck to your eyebrow, and smelling like enthusiastic compost. You carry on, wet and righteous. That night, you sleep beneath a cypress tree, curled like a regrettable sculpture, cradling your dented flask and muttering oaths to Apollo for stronger ankles. Insects bite every part of you that isn't already scratched. You dream of goats with laurel wreaths and sandals made of clouds. When you wake, your back aches, your left eye is slightly swollen, and your tunic smells like defeat. You splash water on your face and call it morning. The next few days blur together into a dry, dusty montage of bruises, missed turns, and unsatisfying snacks. You barter with a fig merchant for a piece of boiled wheat cake, which turns out to be mostly pebble. You try to nap in a thicket and wake up with a thorn in your shin and a beetle in your ear. You meet a fellow traveller who claims to be a long-distance runner from Corinth, but judging by his calves, he may just be a liar. He teaches you a chant for endurance. You forget it within the hour, but pretend it helped. You reach a crossroads marked by a crumbling statue of Hermes, missing both arms and most of his torso. You try to interpret this as symbolic. Maybe it's a message about sacrifice. Maybe it's just a very old statue. You turn left, mostly because right smells like fish. This turns out to be the correct direction, which surprises no one more than you. Eventually the land flattens. The dust turns paler, finer, and much more enthusiastic about clinging to your skin. You see other travellers now, some on foot, others in carts, one on a donkey that looks like it gave up in 500 BCE and hasn't changed expression since. You pass groups of athletes from more prestigious polis laughing loudly, their arms glistening with perfumed oil. You smile at them. They do not smile back. One whispers something about twig legs. You pretend not to hear. At one point, a gust of wind catches your cloak and carries it into a tree. You make several heroic attempts to retrieve it, including one that ends with you dangling from a branch like a confused satyr. You eventually retrieve the garment, but tear the hem and possibly your dignity. You wrap it around your shoulders anyway, like a battle-scarred champion, and carry on with your chin high and your calves visibly chafing. By the 5th day, you begin to understand why actual athletes prepare for this. Your thighs are raw. Your ankles hum with quiet malice. You have developed a faint rash from some questionable olives given to you by a roadside vendor with a suspicious cough. Your skin is sunburned in strange patchy rectangles, thanks to uneven cloak coverage and one ill-advised nap behind a shrub. You look less like a promising competitor and more like someone who lost a bet with Dionysus. And then, finally, mercifully, you see it. At first, just a shimmer on the horizon, pale columns rising from dust, specks of colour moving around them, banners fluttering against the sky like a painter, with no taste in geometry. Then closer, the scent of oil, smoke, and ambition. You hear the clatter of hooves, the bark of commands, the rhythmic slap of sandals against packed earth. You smell sweat, incense, and something burnt that might once have been a snack. Olympia, the sacred grounds, the centre of Greek athletic delusion. You step onto the road leading into the outer camp, where tents sprout like toadstools around the sacred sites. Men stretch, boys run errands, wrestlers grunt. Philosophers loiter with scrolls and smugness. A flute plays in the distance, though mercifully not the same girl from your village. You try to stand tall despite the grime on your legs, the dust in your teeth, and the fact that your left eye still twitches when you move too fast. A man in an official-looking tunic waves you forward, glances at your sandals, one torn, one barely hanging on, and points you toward the registration area with the weary nod of someone who's seen too many hopefuls and not enough winners. You shuffle past him with what you hope is dignity. A goat sneezes nearby. You flinch. As you make your way toward the athlete's staging area, you pass other competitors, sleek, towering, terrifying figures with calves like sculpted tree trunks and shoulders that appear to have their own opinions. You do not make eye contact. One of them glances in your direction, then at your feet, then back at his companion. They both laugh. You pretend to be admiring a particularly interesting patch of ground. You reach the outer wall of the sanctuary, where the dust swirls in slow circles and the stones beneath your feet grow warmer with meaning, or possibly just sun. You stop, adjust your cloak, straighten your spine, and prepare to enter the place where legends are forged, muscles are pulled, and egos go to expire. You are filthy, you are sore, you are dramatically underfed. You are ready, sort of. The first thing that hits you is the smell. Not the inspiring scent of sacred groves or incense from the temple of Zeus. Those are somewhere off in the polite part of Olympia, where the priests and nobles congregate. No, you've arrived in the athlete's village, which is a generous term for a sun-baked field crammed with mismatched tents, overflowing buckets, sweaty optimism, and a pervading stench best described as feet, ambition, and very recent regret. Your name is eventually located on a scroll held by a young man with a voice like a cracked lyre string and the attention span of a sleep-deprived donkey. He waves you toward the southern edge of the encampment without making eye contact, muttering something about overflow accommodations and don't feed the goats. You pass through rows of canvas shelters stitched together with twine, rope and, in one case, what appears to be someone's discarded loincloth. You see men wrestling in patches of dust, others reciting what might be poetry or just very aggressive stretching instructions, and several who seem to be napping directly on their javelins. Your tent, and again this is a charitable term, is a sloped canvas triangle flanked on one side by a Corinthian long jumper with calves like ripened figs, and on the other by a man from Syracuse who claims to be a triple disc thrower, though he has yet to stop coughing long enough to explain what that actually means. You set down your bundle of supplies, which now consists of a damp cloak, a hollowed-out fig stem you're not sure why you kept, and half a sandal. Your designated space is marked by a rope tied between two poles. You're told to stay inside the line. You ask what happens if you don't. No one answers. The Corinthian introduces himself with a glistening handshake, leaving a stripe of oil across your palm that you suspect will remain there until the next Olympic cycle. He informs you that he oils his legs every 10 minutes to keep the spirits of stiffness away. You nod like that's normal. Every few minutes, he reapplies another layer, using a curved strigil and a pot of something that smells like thyme and hubris. The effect is that of a man perpetually on the brink of slipping out of his own skin. He offers you some. You decline. He insists. You pretend to sneeze and look away. There is no privacy in the village. There are no walls, no screens, no modesty whatsoever. Men parade around in various states of undress, adjusting themselves with the casual indifference of goats in heat. You attempt to find a quiet corner to change into your more presentable tunic, only to discover that someone is already using it for shadowboxing. You change anyway, slowly, clumsily, holding your cloak up with one hand and trying not to think about how many of these men could snap you in half by sneezing. You try to settle in, but the ground beneath your tent is made of compacted dirt, sharp pebbles, and what may once have been a sacrificial snack. There is no bedding. Your mat is a woven reed rectangle that smells faintly of mildew and lemon rind. You consider folding your cloak to use as a pillow, only to remember it's still damp from that ill-fated river crossing. You roll it up anyway and lie down gingerly, only to be immediately poked in the spine by something hard. Upon investigation, it turns out to be the sacred pebble you accidentally pocketed 2 days ago. You chuck it outside and mutter an apology to Hermes just in case. Across the tent lane, 2 men are loudly debating the merits of different wrestling stances. One demonstrates his with great enthusiasm, slamming into a barrel that promptly tips over, spilling its contents, mostly water, possibly urine, onto the path. You instinctively lift your feet. The Corinthian next to you doesn't flinch. He says it builds immunity. You assume he's joking. He is not. Meal distribution is announced with a cowbell and a shouted phrase you don't understand, but sprint toward anyway, hobbling slightly. The food queue is a chaotic mass of elbows, raised voices, and deeply unqualified opinions on protein ratios. The meal consists of barley mash, a handful of olives, and something that might be a boiled root or a very confused mushroom. You eat it all. You ask for seconds. They laugh. A man in line beside you asks what event you're competing in. You say, possibly the foot race. He nods solemnly and tells you about his cousin, who once tore every ligament trying to sprint uphill. You thank him for the story. He says it wasn't a story, just a warning. Then he takes your barley mash and walks off. The latrine situation is theoretical. There are buckets. Some are labelled, most are not. One has a sign that reads, "Do not use for olive disposal," in 3 dialects. The smell is indescribable, not because it's complex, but because describing it would legally qualify as an act of violence. You relieve yourself behind a bush instead. So does everyone else. The bush does not survive. Back at your tent, the Corinthian is meditating upside down, legs on a rock, arms folded beneath him. You ask if this helps circulation. He says it helps redirect ambition. You try to copy him and immediately cramp. The Syracuse man offers you a poultice. You ask what's in it. He just smiles and gestures toward a jar filled with what might be garlic, ashes, and a beetle. You say thank you, then quietly bury it. As night falls, the village somehow grows louder. Torches flicker in the wind. Men sing songs of victory that haven't yet occurred. A group near the central path reenacts a javelin throw using a stick, a sleeping mat, and an alarming amount of shouting. Someone starts playing a flute. Another person starts shouting at the flute. You begin to understand why philosophers avoid crowds. You attempt to sleep. You lie on your mat, curl up around your cramping thighs, and close your eyes. The Corinthian begins snoring, a deep, resonant sound like a bull arguing with a thunderstorm. The Syracuse man coughs rhythmically. The wind flaps your tent canvas with the subtlety of an offended seagull. Somewhere nearby, two men are arguing about calf symmetry and slapping their legs for emphasis. A goat bleats. You have no idea where the goat came from. Your mind races with intrusive thoughts. What if your name is mispronounced during the procession? What if your tunic slips during competition, despite the fact that you'll be naked? What if you accidentally bow to the wrong god? What if the Corinthian oils you in your sleep? You roll over, then back. You try lying on your stomach, which feels worse. You try lying on your side, which feels marginally better, until a rock inserts itself directly beneath your rib cage. You try counting something. Fig trees, laurel wreaths. Possible reasons this was a bad idea. Eventually, in the deepest part of the night, you manage to drift into a kind of pseudo-sleep. Not true rest, but a semi-conscious hovering in which you're still aware of the Corinthian muttering about leg flexibility in his dreams and the sound of someone vomiting near the olive buckets. You dream again. This time, you're racing through a tunnel lined with spectators holding figs. The finish line is a couch. When you reach it, it turns into a discus and flies away. You try to follow, but your sandals are full of bees. The next morning begins with shouting. Not the usual competitive grunting or Corinthian sleep muttering, but the distinct bellow of an official voice. Nasal, self-important, and armed with the authority of someone who's read the rules scroll and insists on reciting it. You sit up slowly, your back crackling like a cheap lyre string, and blearily reach for your cloak before remembering that modesty is now a historical footnote. A trumpet blares shrill and undignified. The Corinthian beside you springs up like a startled gazelle and begins oiling his legs before his eyes are fully open. The man from Syracuse attempts to stand, coughs instead, and collapses gently back onto his mat like a half-deflated wineskin. You shuffle toward the central lane of the village, joining the slow, uneven procession of half-awake, half-dressed men heading toward the Temple of Zeus for what you are told will be the official initiation. The phrase Temple of Zeus conjures certain expectations, grandeur, solemnity, thunder. Instead, you're led through a dust path past a goat tied to a post and into a shaded courtyard that smells like burning rosemary and sweat. The temple itself is impressive. Yes, tall columns, carved friezes, a statue of Zeus that could glare your soul into submission. But the surrounding area is decidedly less divine. A man is relieving himself behind a column. Another is attempting to balance on one foot while eating a boiled egg. You try to feel holy. You mostly feel itchy. You and your fellow competitors are herded like ceremonial poultry into rows facing a raised platform where a group of judges stands, draped in pristine white robes and expressions of deep, bone-weary disappointment. They are all old, all male, and all possess foreheads polished to such a shine you suspect divine intervention. One of them raises a scroll. Another clears his throat. A third seems to be asleep. The first begins to speak. The speech, which was likely meant to be stirring, lands somewhere between an overlong poem and an angry weather report. It begins with a reminder that the Olympic Games are sacred, held in honor of Zeus himself, overseen by the gods and bound by ancient custom. You nod solemnly, mostly because your neck is stiff. The judge continues, detailing the rules of conduct with the enthusiasm of a man who has personally witnessed every violation. No clothes, he announces to no one's surprise. No cheating. There is a pause during which 3 men shift uncomfortably. No murder, he adds, with a pointed look toward the Spartans. One of them smiles. The judge continues, clarifying that intentional maiming, bribery and false identity are also forbidden, except in certain events where the lines blur. You raise your hand to ask for clarification. The judge ignores you. The next segment is dedicated to acceptable forms of pain. This includes twisting, grappling, throwing, pinching, slapping, choking, and, confusingly, tickling, though only in certain disciplines. Eye gouging is technically forbidden, but frequently overlooked. You take mental notes that immediately dissolve into a headache. A man beside you mutters, "Just don't die and you'll be fine." You ask if he's competed before. He says no, but he's seen a lot of funerals. Once the rules are recited and the implications poorly absorbed, the judges gesture toward the sacred slab of stone where each athlete is expected to place a hand and recite an oath to Zeus, Hera, Nike, and the spirit of Olympia, swearing to uphold honor, discipline, and the vague hope of not embarrassing anyone too publicly. When your turn comes, you step forward, place your hand firmly on the surprisingly warm slab, clearly touched by every other sweaty man before you, and begin your lines. You fumble the word integrity, accidentally say vegetables instead of victory, and become momentarily distracted by an ant crawling across the inscription. It pauses on the word virtue. You forget the rest of the sentence. No one claps. A judge raises an eyebrow. You bow slightly and return to your place. Then comes the fig ceremony. You are handed a fig, ceremonially, solemnly, and without eye contact, by a priest whose robe smells like incense and loathing. The fig is meant to symbolize humility, gratitude, and perhaps fiber. You hold it gently, reverently, and immediately begin sweating through your palm. A trumpet blares again. You flinch. The fig drops. It rolls across the temple floor, lands near a Spartan's foot, and is immediately crushed under his heel. You consider this an omen. No one offers you another. Next comes the anointing ritual. A young boy, possibly a trainee priest or just someone's nephew, walks down the line with a shallow bowl of olive oil and a brush made from the stiff bristles and bad intentions. He dabs each man's forehead, chest and shoulders, while mumbling something about purification. When he reaches you, he hesitates for a moment, perhaps trying to locate your shoulders beneath the dust, then proceeds with a half-hearted smear and a muttered, "May Zeus forgive you." You say thank you. He has already moved on. There's a brief interlude while a sacrificial animal, this time a very confused-looking ram, is led into the courtyard and honoured with chants, incense and a fruit platter it clearly doesn't want. The priest thanks it for its future contribution to dinner. The ram bleats, perhaps in protest, perhaps in agreement. The entire thing takes longer than expected due to a mix-up involving the ceremonial knife and someone's lunch spoon. As the sun climbs higher, the judges conclude the ritual with a final benediction. They raise their arms, call upon Zeus to watch over the games, and bless each competitor with a chance at glory, or at least survival. A trumpet blasts once more, long and triumphant. The Corinthian next to you shouts, "For honour!" and drops his fig. You feel slightly better. The crowd begins to disperse. Some men stretch, others immediately start wrestling. One begins reciting a poem about courage, while another throws up behind a pillar. You wander aimlessly, unsure whether you've been officially accepted, rejected, or simply absorbed into the bureaucracy of spectacle. A judge passes by. You open your mouth to ask if you've done everything correctly. He gestures toward the olive grove and says, "Don't be late for inspection." Then he disappears into the temple shadows like a particularly judgmental statue. Back at the edge of the village, the Corinthian resumes oiling his legs with renewed fervour. You sit on your mat, clutching your now figless hand, and try to recall the exact wording of your oath. Something about dignity, something about effort, something you're fairly certain about not defiling the sacred goat enclosure. You stare at a real olive lying on the ground, half buried in dust, and wonder if it too once had dreams. You begin to notice for the first time how many of these rituals seem designed not to inspire courage, but to filter out the faint of heart. Between the oil, the speeches, the ants, the confusing rules, and the smell of at least 3 competing bodily functions, it becomes clear that the Olympics aren't just about athleticism. They're about enduring nonsense with a straight face, which you realise might actually be your strongest skill. You lie back slowly, spine popping, and watch a cloud drift across the sun. Somewhere in the distance, a trumpet blares again. You sigh, you close your eyes, you pretend the ground is softer than it is. Eventually you drift back toward the athlete's village, walking in that particular gait of a man who's both uncertain of his future and very sure of the pebble currently lodged in his heel. You pass a man balancing a discus on his head while humming. Another is skipping sideways in a circle while muttering numbers. A third is standing perfectly still, hands clasped behind his back, eyes closed in a way that suggests meditation or an extremely delayed fainting spell. You try not to make eye contact with anyone who looks like they've trained for this. You'd hoped, naively, you now realise, that the other athletes might resemble you, regular men from humble villages, eager to make a name for themselves with sheer effort and one moderately memorable anecdote about goat agility. But as you weave through the open practice fields, that illusion collapses with the speed and elegance of a clay vase under a donkey cart. These men are not humble. They are not regular. They are not, by any stretch of the fig tree, like you. Take, for instance, the Theban discus thrower. He's impossible to miss, mostly because he's the approximate size of a small amphitheatre. His arms look carved, his chest shines like an oiled battlefield, and when he lifts his discus, the nearby trees bend slightly, as if anticipating impact. You pause to watch his form, hoping to absorb something useful by osmosis. He spins once, twice, then hurls the discus with a grunt that echoes through the hills. It lands somewhere behind a tent, accompanied by a distant crash and the shout of a priest. The Theban nods approvingly and drinks directly from a goat's water skin. You move along. Next is the Spartan. There's only one, but he seems to count for several. He wears no expression. He also wears no oil, no tunic, and quite possibly no regard for mortality. You pass him once walking clockwise. He's standing perfectly still, staring at the horizon. 10 minutes later, you pass him again, now walking counterclockwise, and he has not blinked. You wonder if he's a statue. You wonder if he's breathing. You wonder what happened to the last person who asked. You walk faster. Then there's the man they call the Brick. No one knows his real name. No one asks. He has the proportions of a very angry temple column and the neck of a war horse. A whisper passes among the athletes that he once bench-pressed a mule as a child. No one doubts this. You witness him casually lift a full water barrel with one arm and adjust a training weight with the other. When someone hands him an actual brick as a joke, he bites it in half. You pretend not to notice. You don't want to be next. The runners are no better. You assumed, perhaps foolishly, that speed would come in all shapes, lean, wiry, even gangly. But the Rhodian sprint team looks like they were carved from wind and arrogance. You attempt a casual introduction with one of them, a man wearing a woven headband and a thin veneer of self-importance. You smile, offer your name, and mention that you're considering the Stardian. He looks at you, then down at your calves, then back up. He doesn't speak. He just walks away, shaking his head, as if the gods themselves have disappointed him. To make matters worse, these men have not only trained but bonded. There are jokes you don't understand, references to past games, nicknames shared with easy familiarity. One man claps another on the back and says, "Just don't pull a Naxos this time." And everyone laughs. You laugh too, hoping it's not about vomiting. It is. You stop laughing. In an effort to assert some sense of belonging, you decide to stretch. You find a patch of flat ground, roll your shoulders, and attempt a toe touch. You reach your knees. Something pops in your spine. You quickly shift to lunges which look more like falling forward and catching yourself with increasing desperation. A pair of wrestlers pause their warm-up to watch you. One says, "Are you injured or warming up?" You say, "Both." They nod, which you interpret as mercy. Nearby, the long jumpers are doing something that might be stretching or interpretive dance. Their form is impeccable. Their legs are terrifying. One of them leaps a distance you estimate to be the length of your entire home. You mutter "well done" under your breath and try to remember which muscle controls vertical motion. You attempt a small hop just to reassure yourself. It does not go well. You land hard and pretend you meant to stomp. You look for someone, anyone, who seems to be struggling. There must be others here who came on a whim, who trained with homemade weights and delusional hope. But every face you pass radiates focus. Every movement speaks of intent. You overhear a conversation between two men about dietary ratios. One is measuring his water intake with a hollowed pomegranate shell. Another has brought his own figs, carefully wrapped in linen and blessed by a travelling priest. In a desperate bid for solidarity, you approach a younger athlete sitting alone on a rock. He looks thoughtful, maybe even nervous. You ask where he's from. He says Argos. You ask what event he's competing in. He says wrestling. You nod, grateful for his calm demeanour. Then he stands up to his full height, revealing a torso like a sculpture of a bear and hands the size of modest serving platters. He smiles politely and says, "I like to pin people very quickly." You thank him and walk away, slowly, sideways. You return to your tent, if it can still be called that, and flop onto your mat with a graceless grunt. The Corinthian next to you is polishing his elbows and humming something that might be a war hymn or just his leg-oiling rhythm. You stare at the canvas ceiling and try to recall what exactly made you think this was a good idea. Was it the goat-chasing incident? The fig ceremony? The applause you imagined hearing from crowds that now seem much farther away? You close your eyes, you try to focus on your strengths. You once lifted a crate of olives without groaning. You ran from a dog after poking its chicken. You can eat 10 dried figs in one sitting. None of these seem directly applicable now. You briefly consider faking an injury, but realise you've already injured yourself by existing. Outside, the sun is beginning to dip. The training fields are still busy, men throwing, sprinting, shouting, chanting, flinging javelins into the horizon with alarming precision. A discus lands somewhere near the olive grove with a distant thud and a surprised "ow" from a voice you do not recognise. The wind carries the scent of dust, oil, and rising dread. Eventually you drift off. The sun rises with a trumpet blast and a cloud of incense thick enough to stun a goat. You wake curled into a pose that scholars will someday classify as moderate despair. Your shoulder pressed against the canvas wall of the tent, your mouth dry, and your calves locked into a cramp that seems more philosophical than muscular. The Corinthian is already up, glistening, humming, and discussing oil viscosity with a man who looks like he bench presses statues for fun. You sit up slowly and rub your eyes until the world stops spinning, or at least agrees to do so politely. Today is the day the games begin. Not the competition, mind you. That would imply structure, clarity, and a swift descent into injury. No, this is the ceremonial beginning, which is considerably more flamboyant, far less optional, and designed primarily to parade you in front of thousands of spectators while you attempt to look like something other than a confused slab of meat with sandals. Word spreads quickly through the village. Procession lineup begins at midday. attendance mandatory. You're not given a location so much as a vague direction and the command to follow the others and don't trip. You dress as instructed, which is to say, not at all. Every competitor appears in the nude, slicked in oil, posture tense, teeth gritted in varying degrees of false confidence. You glance around and see at least 3 men flexing their calves at no one in particular. One man is whispering affirmations to his own reflection in a bronze shield. You stretch in a way that you hope suggests poise. It mostly just suggests tight hamstrings. You join the queue somewhere near the back, a position you suspect was assigned based on your height, musculature, or general aura of defeat. The procession route winds from the training fields through the outer sanctuary and up to the great altar of Zeus, where priests, judges, and an audience full of people with much cleaner fingernails will be waiting. The path itself is uneven stone, decorated with floral garlands, spilled wine, and the occasional goat dropping. You try to walk with dignity. You mostly walk like someone attempting to appear taller while hiding a limp. The drums begin first, deep, echoing, and far too close to your temples. Then come the flutes, played with such vigour that you worry someone might pass out from effort. Incense burners swing from long poles carried by temple attendants, wafting smoke into your eyes and up your nose. You blink rapidly, tears welling, trying to look noble and not like someone about to sneeze on a high priest. The procession lurches forward in staggered harmony. Each contingent is announced by region, then by discipline. The Spartans, of course, go first, marching like a single terrifying organism carved from rage and discipline. The crowd roars. The Spartans do not acknowledge it. They don't even blink. Then come the Thebans, the Corinthians, the Rhodesians. Each group gleams. Each is met with applause, cheers, whistles, and, in the case of the Argives, some chanting that may be illegal in certain city-states. Then it's your group's turn. The herald squints at the scroll and clears his throat. He says your polis's name once. Wrong. He says it again. Still wrong, but now somehow insulting. He tries a third time, lands on something close enough, and gives up. The crowd, having no idea where that is, reacts with tepid applause and a polite cough. You wave weakly. No one waves back. You march forward with what you hope resembles pride, but you're jostled immediately by the Corinthian, who is still oily despite the heat and now leaving a trail of glistening footprints behind him like a philosophical slug. Another man from your group bumps your shoulder and mutters something about spacing. You attempt to regain position, but the line is moving too fast and the ground is growing more uneven. You don't recognize this part of the path. You begin to sweat more, not the glistening kind, but the itchy, blotchy kind that feels like your body's way of saying, I tried to warn you. You approach the temple steps. A carpet of petals has been laid down, though many have already been trampled into pulp. A group of dignitaries looks on from a raised platform. Priests in layered robes, judges in spotless white, and a very serious woman holding what may be a ceremonial goose. You make eye contact with her. She does not blink. You look away. The drums build, the flutes rise, the air thickens with smoke and tension. Just ahead of you, the Corinthian does a little hop as he ascends the steps, turning to flash the crowd a grin that actually earns a smattering of applause. You hate him. You try to follow with similar flair, adjusting your stride to account for the pothole. A pothole which, as it turns out, is not where you thought it was. Your foot catches. Your balance abandons you with the elegance of a startled deer. Your arms windmill. Your right leg lifts, then bends, then does something that defies geometry. Your entire body twists forward with theatrical commitment. You see the crowd. Then you see the ground. Then you see cake. More specifically, you see the sacrificial offering, a ceremonial cake of barley, honey, and dried fruit, arranged with loving care and placed upon a silver platter near the sacred flame. It was meant to honour the gods. It was not meant to cushion the fall of a middling athlete from a polis no one can locate on a map. You land face first, there's a squish, then a crack, which might be the platter or possibly your pride. The priest nearest you gasps. The crowd makes a collective sound, somewhere between sympathy and joy. Someone claps ironically. You remain motionless for a moment, half submerged in honey and crushed figs, your limbs arranged like a dropped marionette. A bit of ceremonial garnish sticks to your ear. The drums stop. The flutes trill awkwardly. Someone coughs. A goat bleats. You slowly, very slowly, push yourself upright. Bits of cake slide off your chest and down your shins. You blink against the honey in your eyes. The priest steps forward and gently picks a raisin out of your hair. He says nothing. You say nothing. A judge makes a note on a scroll. You wonder if it's under violations or entertainment. You stagger to your feet and resume walking, though the line has already passed you. You are now alone. Behind you, a temple servant begins scooping what remains of the offering into a new bowl, muttering under his breath. Ahead, the path continues to the altar. You follow it dripping. The petals stick to your feet. Your fig-smeared shin makes a squelching sound with each step. As you approach the final platform, another judge leans in and whispers, "Quite the entrance." You smile weakly and reply, "It was strategic." He chuckles. You briefly wonder if this counts as charisma. Once the ceremony concludes, you're allowed to return to the athlete's village. You walk the long path back without speaking. No one speaks to you either. A few chuckle as you pass. One man offers you a scrap of cloth to wipe your arm. Another says, "Tough break." You thank him. Then trip slightly on a sandal strap and pretend it was on purpose. Back at your tent, the Corinthian is practicing discus form in slow motion, as though preparing for a statue commission. He looks at you and says, "You made an impression." You say, "That was the idea." He nods as though you've spoken the words of a seasoned tactician and resumes his routine. You sit down, sticky, sore, and newly aware of how quickly glory can ferment into spectacle. You pick a raisin off your arm and eat it. You wish you hadn't. You lie back, legs aching, head spinning slightly from the sugar and embarrassment. The drums still echo faintly in your ears, punctuated by the memory of laughter and the sensation of cake meeting collarbone. You stare at the canvas ceiling. You do not feel ceremonial. You do not feel sacred. You feel like a man who was briefly part of a religious offering and then quietly removed. You spend the morning after your ceremonial faceplant attempting to remove dried honey from your leg hair. It's not easy. It hardens overnight into something between sap and shame. The Corinthian kindly offers you some olive oil to help loosen it, which does technically work, although it leaves your legs glistening like an overripe pastry. You still smell faintly of baked fruit and singed dignity, and your nose is a little crooked now, though that might just be the swelling. You're mid-squat, scraping fig from your knee with a stick when the trumpet sounds. Not the ceremonial kind. This one is shorter, sharper, and designed to strike fear into anyone who has forgotten what they signed up for. You look around. Some men perk up. Others begin hopping in place. One stretches by pulling his leg behind his head. You pretend to stretch too, then immediately regret it when something pops near your hip. A boy approaches your tent with a scroll. He doesn't read from it. He just stares at you and says, "You're up." You blink. He gestures toward the central arena with the resigned patience of someone who's delivered this message to a lot of nervous-looking men this week. You try to ask what event this is for. He shrugs. You ask who you're up against. He shrugs harder. Then he turns and walks away. You follow slowly. The pancration arena is just outside the main sanctuary, a ring of packed dirt surrounded by a low rope, and the kind of crowd that gathers for both triumph and public injury. There are no seats, only spectators standing shoulder to shoulder, craning their necks for a better view of what is, in theory, a sport, and in practice, a legal brawl with a religious exemption. Pancration, you've been told, is a blend of wrestling and boxing. What no one mentioned is that it also includes choking, biting, if no one sees it, twisting joints in unnatural directions, and one particularly unsettling manoeuvre known only as the Heraclean kiss, which you assume has nothing to do with affection. You step into the ring and immediately regret your life. Your opponent is already waiting. They call him Leon the Goat, though the resemblance to any actual goat is minimal. He's not small, he's not cheerful, he's not particularly fond of grazing. Instead, he's a wall of flesh and sinew, topped with a thick neck, and the expression of someone who once bit a shield and liked it. His hair is cropped short, his eyes are wide and unblinking, and his chest bears the scars of previous matches, one of which looks suspiciously like teeth. You attempt a friendly nod. He snorts. The judge steps into the ring, raises one hand, and announces both your names. Leon's name is met with murmurs, nods, and someone in the back whispering, "Oh no, your name is mispronounced again." The crowd remains silent, except for one confused cheer that may have been sarcastic. The judge gives the signal. There is no bell. There is no countdown. There is only Leon, moving faster than anyone his size should be legally allowed. You manage to sidestep his first lunge. This is your greatest accomplishment of the day, and it will not be repeated. He turns, grabs your wrist, and twists it in a direction you are fairly sure is not endorsed by anatomy. You squeal, not loudly, but audibly, and attempt to retaliate by stepping on his foot. His foot does not react. You attempt a counter-grapple, which mostly resembles a polite hug with panicked intentions. He responds by elbowing you squarely in the nose. Your vision goes briefly white. You stumble back, arms flailing, tasting blood and the faint memory of cheese. You try to remember what the Corinthians said about grounding your stance. Unfortunately, he said it during the leg oiling lecture, so all you recall is stay slippery. You fall backward into the dirt. Leon lunges again. You roll away, accidentally scraping your elbow on the rope boundary. Someone in the crowd boos. You're not sure if it's meant for you or Leon, but either way, you take it personally. You scramble upright, panting, and attempt to kick. Leon catches it with one hand. He looks mildly annoyed, like you've interrupted a meal. Then he pushes your leg upward and shoves you backward in the same motion. You land hard, spine first, and gasp like a beached fish. The judge yells something about engagement. You wave one hand in vague acknowledgement and attempt to get up again. Leon gives you a moment. This is not generosity, it's strategy. You try to appreciate the sportsmanship. Then he knees you in the liver. Time slows. You feel the impact in your molars. You briefly forget your name, your polis, and the concept of ambition. Your legs stop receiving orders from your brain. You crumple. Somewhere distantly, a trumpet blows. You suspect it's not for you. You hear the judge shouting, "Not words, just volume." The crowd is reacting. Some with excitement, some with horror. One person near the front laughs like they've just spilled their wine and discovered something better beneath it. You try to raise a hand, perhaps to signal surrender or beg for medical herbs. The judge doesn't notice, or worse, he does, and chooses not to. You attempt a word, any word. Mercy seems like a good candidate, but your tongue has retreated into your throat, out of sheer self-preservation. You gargle a syllable. Leon responds by pressing a knee into your ribcage and twisting your arm like he's trying to extract an oath from it. Your final thoughts are as follows. I should have picked javelin. I think that fig was fermented. At least I skipped cheese for this. And then everything fades. No glory, no applause, just darkness, bruised ribs, and the distant scent of someone else's victory. You wake up staring at a ceiling you don't recognize, beneath a blanket that smells like damp wool and disappointment. The light is harsh. Your mouth tastes like dirt and old fig. You're lying on a cot, if you can call it that, constructed from canvas stretched over a frame that creaks every time you breathe. There's something cold and wet pressed against your forehead. You hope it's medical. You suspect it might be a cabbage leaf. Your nose is bleeding, or it was. There's a crust of dried red across your upper lip, and the distinct sensation that something inside your face has shifted positions. You reach up to touch it, then stop halfway because your shoulder protests like you've asked it to carry a bronze statue uphill. Your arm is swollen. Your ribs ache. One of your knees appears to be twice its normal size, and your abdomen pulses with the bruised memory of Leon the goat's kneecap. For a moment, you don't move, partly because you can't, and partly because you're not entirely sure which parts of you are still yours. You lie still, breathing slowly through your mouth, trying to remember how many people saw what happened. The number is somewhere between a packed crowd and everyone with eyes and a sense of humour. You groan. The cot creaks again. Someone nearby snorts. You turn your head, very gently, and find yourself in a long canvas tent, dimly lit and filled with the sounds of slow breathing, occasional moaning, and the soft clatter of someone stirring something in a bowl. The air smells of sweat, herbs, wine, and failure. You are not alone. You count at least 6 other men sprawled across cots, each in various stages of bandaging, bruising, or whimpering. One of them is missing an eyebrow. Another appears to be arguing with a bird that isn't there. A young man in a rough tunic approaches and peers down at you. He doesn't introduce himself. He just raises one eyebrow and says, "You're awake." That's rare. You try to ask what happened. What comes out is a soft gargle. He nods anyway. Pancration, right? With Leon? You attempt to nod. Your neck doesn't cooperate. "Yeah," he says. "We've had 3 this week. You lasted longer than the Corinthian." He bit his own tongue and passed out. This information comforts you briefly. Then you remember that the Corinthian can probably still do handstands with one hand and quote Stoic philosophy from memory while oiling his shins. You, meanwhile, can barely blink without pain. You're offered water from a wooden ladle that smells like it was once used for soup. You drink it anyway. It tastes faintly of time and regret. The healer, or assistant, or possibly just a bored volunteer, unwraps the cloth around your wrist and peers at the swelling. He pokes it once, nods, then wraps it again with something damp and sticky. You don't ask questions. You don't have the strength. After what might be an hour or a year, a priest enters. You can tell he's a priest by the gold embroidery on his robe and the faint look of superiority that comes from spending your days near altars and away from fists. He glances at you, mutters a prayer, and reaches into a pouch. He withdraws a fig. It's very round, very ripe, and held out like a reward. You stare at it, slowly, deliberately. You shake your head. He raises an eyebrow. You shake your head again, a small, pathetic movement, but firm. He shrugs and moves on. Eventually, you're deemed stable enough to stand, which is a generous interpretation of your current abilities. With help, you swing your legs over the side of the cot. They feel like damp wood. Your knees crack. Your ribs ache with every motion. You thank the healer in the strained tone of a man who has forgotten what dignity feels like. He pats you on the back, right on the bruises. You manage not to scream. He looks satisfied. You limp out of the aftermath tent into a late afternoon sun that feels far too cheerful. The brightness stabs at your eyes, the dust stings the cuts on your legs. Every step feels like your body is trying to negotiate a ceasefire. You pass a group of boys near the training field, reenacting what appears to be a pancration match. One of them shouts, "I'm the goat," and knees his friend in the gut. You pretend not to hear. The walk back to the athletes' village is long. You pass familiar tents, familiar faces, none of whom speak to you. The other competitors avoid your gaze in the way one avoids looking directly at a collapsing structure. You are no longer a potential rival. You are a cautionary tale with a limp. When you reach your tent, you find the Corinthian gone, off at some smug massage, probably. and a fresh set of linen folded beside your mat. You sit down gingerly and attempt to wash the dirt from your arms with a damp cloth that may have once been white. The bruises are already purpling. Your left wrist now bends at a discouraging angle. You take a deep breath and immediately regret it. Later that evening, someone stops by your tent to show you something funny. It's a broken pottery shard, about the size of your hand, etched crudely with the image of a man falling on his back, legs flailing, and what might be a goat's head hovering above him. It is labelled Leon's Breakfast. You stare at it for a long moment, then nod. The man grins. "It's making the rounds," he says. "You've gone semi-famous." You thank him with a grimace and lie back down. Across the village, laughter rises from the dining tent. The crowd roars briefly. You assume someone just lost a tooth or their innocence. Your stomach growls, but you're not ready to face food, or the eyes that come with it. Just before nightfall, a healer returns to offer you ointment. It's in a small clay pot unmarked. You open it and sniff. The smell is indescribable, sharp, earthy, with notes of vinegar, garlic, and possibly despair. You ask what's in it. He just smiles. You say nothing and smear a little on your ribs. The burning begins immediately. You close your eyes and wait for it to become numb. It doesn't. The tent flap rustles in the wind. Distant trumpets sound again. Not for you, not this time. Somewhere, a man is practicing throws. Somewhere, another man is being carried from the ring. The cycle continues. The games grind on. You lie very still, ribs wrapped, wrist splinted, pride fractured, and try to remember why you came here in the first place. Unfortunately, you can't. Not clearly, not anymore. The next morning you wake to the sound of thunder. Not from the sky, the weather is painfully clear, but from the rhythmic pounding of hooves against earth. The chariot races have begun. You can hear them from your mat, a rising cacophony of cheering, whipping, cracking, and the occasional scream. The tent shudders with each wave of noise. You pull the cloth over your eyes and try to disappear. It doesn't work. Nothing disappears in Olympia, except perhaps dignity. You sit up slowly, wincing at the full-body ache that now defines your existence. Your wrist is still wrapped in stiff linen. Your ribs have settled into a steady, unignorable throb. You chew a few stale barley crumbs and contemplate your life choices. You decide it's too late to undo most of them, so you might as well limp toward the chariot grounds and watch other people risk their lives for applause and olives. The road to the hippodrome is long, dusty, and increasingly crowded. Spectators press in from all sides. Citizens, nobles, foreigners, even the occasional philosopher, pretending not to enjoy the carnage. You hobble past vendors selling honeyed nuts, laurel wreaths, and suspiciously greasy meat. One man offers you a seat rental for half a drachma. You inform him that you're already sitting, just not horizontally. The hippodrome itself is enormous, an open, sun-baked oval with rutted tracks worn deep from years of hoof and wheel. A low barrier runs through the centre, flanked by statues and columns, many of which are missing arms, heads, or dignity. The seating is simple, rows of rough stone ledges or flattened dirt banks, packed with bodies sweating under tunics and shouting over one another in 7 dialects at once. You find a spot on a ledge that smells like someone previously bled on it, ease yourself down with the grace of a wounded turtle, and exhale through your teeth. A trumpet sounds. The crowd goes quiet for one glorious moment. Then the gates open. The chariots burst forth like angry furniture hurled by the gods. Each is pulled by 4 horses, lean, furious creatures that look more like nightmares, with bridles than anything mortal. The drivers stand precariously on narrow wooden frames, gripping reins with white-knuckled desperation, their expressions fixed somewhere between determination and prayer. You count 6 teams. One of them is already veering slightly to the left. This does not seem intentional. The race begins in a storm of dust and noise. The chariots careen around the first turn, narrowly missing a pillar. The crowd surges forward with a collective gasp. A child behind you yells, "Break his wheel!" with alarming enthusiasm. Someone else throws a fig pit at a passing driver. It lands harmlessly on the track, where it is instantly pulverized by 16 hooves. You chew an unripe olive slowly, watching noblemen slam their vehicles into each other at 30 paces. It's majestic, in the same way a thunderstorm is majestic, beautiful to behold, and deeply unwise to participate in. One chariot loses control, clips a corner, and spins wildly. The driver tumbles off and disappears into the dust. The horses continue on, dragging the empty frame behind them like a symbolic warning. The crowd roars, you flinch. The man beside you, broad-shouldered, sunburned, and munching on a roasted grasshopper, chuckles and says, "That's the Athenian team. Happens every time." You nod like you understand. You do not. You try to take another bite of olive, but your jaw clicks. You settle for watching silently and clutching your ribs. The lap continues. A second chariot loses a wheel, sending it cartwheeling through the air in a perfect, horrifying arc. It sails over the crowd with grace and menace and lands directly on a minor statue of Hermes, decapitating it cleanly. The crowd roars again, louder this time, as if the destruction of public art was the true event they came for. The driver of the maimed chariot flings his whip into the dust and begins chasing his horses on foot. You watch as he gradually loses both distance and dignity. The remaining drivers jostle for position, their chariots grinding and rattling with every turn. One of them lashes his horses with a rhythmic precision that's almost hypnotic. You blink, and he's crossed the finish line. The race is over. The crowd explodes into cheers, jeers, chants, and half-hearted applause. Coins change hands, bets are settled, arguments begin. You remain seated, rubbing your ribs and wondering if perhaps there's a medical benefit to watching violence instead of participating in it. You decide there is. You just don't know the name for it yet. After the dust settles, you try to stand. Your knees do not agree. You compromise by leaning forward and pushing up with your good arm, muttering curses in the general direction of Leon the goat. You hobble away from the hippodrome, passing broken wheels, smeared tracks, and one very dazed man being helped into a cart by his teammates. You make a mental note. Chariots are best viewed from a distance, a great distance, preferably one with shade. On the way back toward the training grounds, you pass the discus field. A small crowd has gathered, less raucous, more polite, mostly older men, with long beards and thin patience. You decide to stop. You settle yourself beneath a fig tree at the edge of the field and lean carefully against the trunk. The bark is warm, the shade is uneven. You accept both conditions without complaint. The athletes here are quieter, focused, calculating. Each stands in a ring of flattened earth, wind testing their robes, arms raised like poised dancers with unusually large dinner plates. The discus itself is heavier than it looks. One man lifts it, turns once, twice, then hurls it forward with a grunt. It flies in a graceful arc, lands somewhere far away, and is immediately chased down by a child with a chalk stick and very little fear. You watch 4 throws. One lands in a patch of sand, one lands near the bushes, one lands short. The last one sails over the boundary rope and into a group of inattentive spectators. You hear a thud, followed by a shriek, then silence, then a very angry voice yelling about teeth. You clutch your ribs tighter and scoot a little farther behind the tree. The fig tree, for its part, does nothing to protect you from projectiles, but provides just enough visual obstruction to let you pretend you're not technically part of the audience. You feel safer in the illusion. You chew a piece of stale bread and reflect on your current status. Not a competitor, not a victor, Not even a good cautionary tale, just a bruised man with a limp and a new understanding of the word miscalculation. Another discus flies. It lands with a satisfying thump. The thrower raises his arms. A few spectators clap. Someone nearby says, "Not bad. Still won't beat the brick." You look around but see no sign of him. Probably bench pressing statues again. A priest walks by, collecting lost prayer tokens and muttering about honouring discipline while stepping over discarded food. He glances at you, pauses, then moves on. You take this as a compliment, or at least not an insult. As the sun dips lower, the shadows grow long. You stretch your legs, slowly, and consider heading back to the tent. Your body disagrees. It would rather stay here, behind this fig tree, watching other men perform the tasks you once thought yourself capable of. You watch one more throw, less for entertainment and more for closure. It's a good one. The discus arcs high, glittering in the sun before vanishing into the brush. You hear a muffled curse, then applause. You exhale. Maybe tomorrow you'll try again. Maybe today, you decide, is a day for spectating. From a very, very safe distance. The next day, you tell yourself you've recovered. That the swelling has gone down, that your ribs are only mildly cracked now, and that the limp in your left leg is largely performative. You've rested. You've spectated. You've consumed questionable broth and slightly less questionable figs. And after all, wasn't this your original plan? To run? To enter the Stadion sprint and show the world, or at least a disinterested portion of it, that your leg still holds something approaching potential? Yes, that's what you tell yourself. It is not, strictly speaking, true. You reach the registration tent with the gait of a man who was recently introduced to the concept of gravity through force. The attendant takes one look at your wrapped wrist, bruised shin, and uneven shoulder height, and asks, "Are you sure?" You nod. He sighs. He scribbles your name with something between pity and professional detachment. You're assigned to the third heat. You wonder how many men need to fall before that qualifies as a final. The stadium track is simple, a long straight strip of packed earth framed by stone blocks and human anticipation. There are no lanes, no staggered starts, no helpful markings, just a beginning, an end, and a wide, chaotic middle where chaos is born and pride comes to perish. You arrive early, partly because you're nervous and partly because you've confused third heat with third overall, and now you're 30 minutes early with no one to explain the difference. You sit on a flat stone near the starting line and watch the first group prepare. They stretch with terrifying precision. Some bounce on their toes. One claps his thighs rhythmically. Another mutters to himself in Doric, possibly casting a spell. When the trumpet sounds, they explode forward like human spears, legs flying, arms pumping, bare feet slapping the ground in unison. The crowd erupts. You gape. You are not prepared for this level of commitment. You are picturing something more ambling. By the time your heat is cooled, your stomach is a tight knot of stale olive bread and anxiety. You rise stiffly, shake out your arms in a way that's meant to look limber, but mostly looks like you're trying to remove a bee from your tunic, and walk to the line. There are 5 other runners in your heat, all taller than you, all younger than you, all visibly without bandages. You stand beside them, chest bare, arms at your sides, knees already preparing to betray you. A man to your left flexes his toes. The one to your right glances at your wrapped wrist and nods politely. You nod back. You both know this is going to be terrible. The judge raises his arm. The trumpet is raised to lips. You inhale deeply. And the trumpet sounds. You push off with your right foot and surge forward, or try to. You manage 2 steps, maybe 3. And then your toe catches something invisible but cruel. A clump of dry grass, a rock, the will of the gods. Your momentum shifts, your balance flees, your body responds with a full surrender. You pitch forward, arms outstretched, trying to regain control. You don't. You tumble, Once, twice, then a third time for emphasis. Your elbow scrapes the earth. Your knee slams into something sharp. Your head smacks the ground hard enough to jostle your fig-based breakfast memories. You land in a sandal. Not yours. Someone ahead of you, a much faster, much more confused competitor, has lost their footwear mid-stride. Your face connects with it, and you remain there for a moment, cheek against leather, dignity escaping like steam from a cracked amphora. The race continues without you. You hear the thundering footfalls, the cheers of the crowd, the triumphant gasp as someone crosses the line, far, far ahead of your current position. You do not look up. You know exactly what you'll see. Eventually the noise dies down. The heat is over. You roll onto your back, staring up at the blue, traitorous sky, and contemplate your options. You could pretend you were never in the race. You could fake a seizure. You could claim to have been cursed by a minor household deity. Or, and this is the worst option, you could finish. So you crawl, slowly, grimly, dragging your bruised body forward with your good arm, knees digging into the dirt, one leg half functioning, the other moving purely out of spite. You pass the halfway point. You pass the place where you fell. You pass the sandal which someone has retrieved and is now holding like a relic. You keep crawling. Somewhere behind the finishing line, a boy claps. Once. You finally reach the end, roll onto your side, and curl into a position that may once have been fetal, but now resembles a very tired shrimp. The judge walks over, peers down at you, and says, "Technically, you didn't disqualify yourself." You thank him. You're not sure why. You rise slowly, using the judge's staff as a temporary crutch. Every joint protests. Your knees are scraped, your nose is bleeding again. A woman in the crowd says something about bravery, but you're too winded to detect whether it's sarcastic. You limp off the track with as much dignity as can be carried in a bruised, olive-smeared vessel. The crowd parts. No one meets your eyes. No one says a word. You pass a group of children reenacting the race with exaggerated stumbles and groans. One of them shouts, "Look, I'm the one who tripped in the grass." He falls theatrically. They all laugh. You do not stop limping. You do not stop moving. You do, however, begin to limp on the other leg. Your good leg, just to give the impression that your failure was the result of injury and not reality. It doesn't help, but it feels better than the truth. You make your way to the communal baths with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who has nothing left to prove and too many bruises to bend. The entrance is marked by a stone lintel and the faint aroma of boiling thyme and male self-delusion. Inside, it is humid, echoing, and far too populated. Bodies crowd every surface, lounging, scrubbing, sweating, and arguing over who actually won, what and whether it counts if the judge sneezed during the throw. The room is a long, low-ceilinged chamber made of dark stone and steaming breath. Pools bubble in corners, arranged by temperature, hot, hotter, and thermonuclear regret. You choose the middle one, not because you're feeling brave, but because the cold basin is currently occupied by two men loudly discussing calf symmetry. You shuffle to a bench, remove your wrappings, one bandage at a time, and try not to look at the bruises. They're spreading. You name one of them Leon. You lower yourself into the water, inch by inch, like a man negotiating with a vengeful deity. The heat sears your skin, then your ribs, then your soul. You bite down on a groan and let your head sink back. Eyes half closed, breathing through your mouth because your nose is still pretending it's ornamental. For a moment, you almost feel something approaching peace. That ends when someone cannonballs in next to you, sending a tidal wave of hot water up your left nostril. You sputter. The offender, a cheerful discus thrower with shoulders like barn doors, and a voice that immediately begins singing an off-key hymn to Apollo, apologizes by patting your head like a pet goat. He launches into a story about his final throw, the angle of his wrist, and the crowd's reaction, which he insists was electric. You nod dazed, and hope he stops. He doesn't. He sings another verse, louder this time. You move to the edge of the pool, where you're immediately handed a porous stone and told to scrub. By whom, you're not sure. It might be an attendant. It might just be a man who believes strongly in exfoliation. Either way, you obey. You begin dragging the stone across your arm, removing layers of grime, oil, and whatever's left of your optimism. The process is less cleansing and more scouring. Your skin turns pink, then red, then something between pain and penance. A man to your left begins describing his javelin technique, while slapping his thighs for emphasis. A man to your right shaves his arm hair with a sharpened shell. The discus thrower is now singing about victory wreaths and mispronouncing half the words. You long for silence. You long for solitude. You briefly consider dunking yourself and not resurfacing until after the games. And then someone does it for you. You're mid-thought, possibly imagining an alternate life as a cheerful potter, when a hand grips the back of your head and plunges you under. The water rushes into your ears, your mouth, your thoughts. You flail upwards, sputtering, coughing, wild-eyed. The man who did it smiles. Helps clear the head, he says. You nod, dripping. You do not forgive him. You stumble out of the pool and head for the rinsing basin, where lukewarm water pours from a spout shaped like a lion's head. It trickles slowly, like regret. You splash some over your chest, which now bears the full bruised impression of a sandal, a discus fragment, and possibly a fig. Your ribs protest, your arm shakes. You decide you've had enough. But then, just as you're preparing to leave, a priest blocks your path. Not the kindly fig-offering sort. This one wears a robe starched to within an inch of sanctity and holds a brush like it's a weapon. He points at your shoulder and says, "You missed a spot." You say you're done. He says no one's done until they've faced their flaws. You say you're tired. He says tiredness is a form of weakness, invented by cowards and soft fruit. You tell him quite calmly that your body is a collection of unpleasant sounds and slow regrets, and you would like to dry off and limp into the evening with what's left of your spirit intact. He tells you pain is virtuous. You tell him your toe is bleeding. He tells you virtue begins at the toe. You argue for 5 minutes, growing increasingly wet and less coherent. Eventually, he wins. Not because his logic is flawless, but because he's louder and refuses to blink. You submit. He scrubs your back with a bristle brush that may have once been used on livestock. You leave the pool redder than you entered, morally intact, but epidermally compromised. You dry off with a towel that isn't yours. You know this because it's embroidered with someone else's name and smells faintly of cedar. You don't care. You just want to be dry. You pat yourself down, gingerly avoiding the parts of you that resemble maps of ancient battlefields, and pull on your tunic. It sticks to your ribs. You take a deep breath and feel exactly none of the clarity you were promised. As you step outside, the evening air hits you with a wall of chill and dust. You shiver. Your skin is still steaming slightly. Your scalp itches from temple herbs, and your sense of control over your own life has officially evaporated into bathhouse condensation. You pass a polished bronze mirror propped near the entrance. Decorative, perhaps ceremonial. You glance at it, then you look away. You do not recognize the man reflected back. He looks tired, bruised, slightly cleaner than before, but colder too. His eyes have seen too much. His legs have run too little. He is not a hero. He is not even a memorable failure. He is just damp. And with that, you walk back to your tent. Cleaner, yes, but colder, and more defeated than before. The morning of the final ceremony arrives with the ceremonial trumpet blast, longer, louder, and somehow more smug than before. You dress slowly, carefully. Your tunic, slightly damp from last night's steam and self-pity, clings to your shoulder in a way that reminds you how little fabric was ever meant to stretch. Your arm, still bound in the sling provided by a sympathetic healer, hangs awkwardly at your side. You consider undoing it for the sake of appearance. Then you try to lift your elbow and are instantly reminded that appearance is a luxury reserved for people with functioning tendons. Outside, the sacred grounds hum with the anticipation of finality. The games are over. The olive wreaths have been woven. The priests have said their blessings. The judges have deliberated. And the crowd, or the crowds are just here for the show. You are not in the show. You are in the audience. More specifically, in the losers section, which is not officially labelled as such, but is nevertheless conspicuously adjacent to the fig vendor and strategically shaded by a tree that drops something unpleasant every few minutes. You take your seat, a stone slab rubbed smooth by centuries of other men who almost mattered, and shift your weight to avoid pressure on your more expressive bruises. Beside you, a man with a broken nose and 2 black eyes mutters something about poetic justice. You nod. Behind you, someone sneezes and declares it a divine omen. You wonder if the gods are trying to drown the ceremony in subtle insults. The trumpets sound again. The procession begins. At the head of the column are the judges, robed, bearded, and gleaming with the kind of righteousness that only men who've never run a foot race can truly embody. Behind them come the priests, carrying wreaths of sacred olive leaves on silver trays, their steps measured, their expressions serene. You briefly consider what it must feel like to carry victory in a bowl. You assume it's lighter than regret. And then come the victors. One by one they step forward, the champions of each event, paraded like demigods in human form. The chariot driver who managed not to kill his horses, the wrestler who dislocated 2 shoulders and neither of them his own, the discus thrower who sang his own name during his final throw. Even Leon the goat gets his moment, striding past with a bruised lip and a satisfied smirk, raising his arms to the sky as though he was the sky. The crowd roars as you clap slowly. With one hand, the other is in a sling. The wreaths are placed upon their heads with exaggerated ceremony. The crowd surges forward, pressing close to catch glimpses of muscles, sweat, and the strange glow that follows victory. Flowers are thrown, bread is offered. Someone plays a flute with just enough enthusiasm to imply future blackmail. The victors nod humbly or try to. Some wave. One blows a kiss. You scowl. A judge pauses near your section and delivers a short, rehearsed speech about valor and participation. He uses the phrase valiant effort. He does not look in your direction. A few people around you nod. A man behind you claps once. The fig vendor wipes his hands on his apron and mutters something about wasted talent. A child nearby turns to you, wide-eyed, curious, armed with the brutal honesty of someone too young to lie for social comfort. He tugs on your tunic and asks, "Did you win anything?" You consider your options. You could lie. You could say you came in second. You could claim the chariot races were rigged. Instead, you mutter, "Experience." He nods solemnly, then laughs. You do not respond. Across the courtyard, another group of competitors reenacts the final sprint with exaggerated flair, each trying to outdo the last in exaggerated falls, noble recoveries, and mock-serious declarations of triumph. One of them pretends to collapse and says, "For the olive." Another shouts, "For figs and glory." A small cluster of spectators applauds. It's not clear if the applause is for their performance or your absence. The ceremony continues. Speeches are given, oaths are repeated, the victors are blessed, cheered, and promised immortality in song, or at least in vague local ballads performed by relatives with limited pitch. You sit very still, your ribs aching, your elbows stiff, and your eyes drifting across the stone tiles to a pile of discarded garlands, left wilting in the heat. You wonder if anyone will pick them up. Eventually, the final name is called. The last wreath is placed. The trumpet blows its last triumphant note. The crowd begins to stir. You rise slowly, carefully, like a man trying not to leak. Around you, others do the same, some limping, some silent, some pretending they aren't crying into their beards. You say nothing. There's nothing to say. As you turn to leave, the child from earlier skips past you, waving a fig. He says, "You looked good when you fell." You thank him. He does not hear you. He's already gone. You walk back through the village, past the empty practice fields, the discarded towels, the half-eaten barley cakes. The air smells like sweat, wine, and closure. Your path takes you past the altar of Nike, where a priest is still muttering a final prayer for the victors. You do not stop. You've heard enough blessings for one lifetime. Back at your tent, the Corinthian is packing. His bag is full of scrolls, strigils, and what appears to be a laurel-infused hairbrush. He glances at you, raises an eyebrow, and says, "Nice clapping." You tell him your arm is in a sling. He shrugs. "So was mine last year," he says. "Didn't stop me." You do not respond, you do not pack. You sit on the edge of your mat, remove your sandal, and stare at the ground. You are not a champion. You are not a name in the scroll. You are not even a footnote. You are a man with a sling and a limp. And right now, that's enough. You leave Olympia with a sling on one arm, a satchel full of nothing, and a smile that doesn't quite reach your eyes. The smile is for formality, for dignity, for the illusion that something meaningful just occurred. You hold it in place as you shuffle past tents being dismantled, oil jars being corked, and victorious men already halfway through autographing pottery. You manage not to trip over the temple steps on the way out, which by current standards is your most successful physical feat of the week. The road back is longer than it should be, somehow dustier, somehow hotter, as though the gods themselves have decided to lean in just a little harder now that the olive wreaths are gone. The sandals you manage to hold together with a strip of borrowed linen finally betray you 3 hours into the return journey. You leave one behind in a patch of cracked mud after it fails to survive a particularly philosophical encounter with a goat hoof. You do not retrieve it, you simply sigh and keep walking, one foot slapping rhythmically against the dry road like a man slowly losing an argument with the earth. You pass other travellers, farmers, pilgrims, a tax collector who walks like he's carrying the concept of guilt in his satchel. One man sells grapes from a cart that also smells faintly of fish. Another offers to trade you a small songbird for your remaining sandal. You decline politely. The bird looks like it would judge you. Your ribs still ache. Your arm is still bound. Your dignity, technically speaking, is not with you. It chose to remain behind, likely somewhere near the sacrificial cake or the bathhouse drain. You begin to suspect it has no intention of rejoining you. For company, you are blessed, and this is using the term loosely, with a travelling bard. He joins your path about halfway through the second day, armed with a lyre, a jug of questionable wine, and a gift for inserting himself into other people's tragedies. He introduces himself as Callios the Golden-Throated. You consider calling him Callios the Immediately Regrettable, but hold your tongue. He plays well enough. If you enjoy being reminded of your failures set to music, it doesn't take long for him to launch into his latest composition, a rousing and deeply unrequested ballad about the glories of the Olympic pancration, featuring, of course, Leon the goat. He describes Leon's speed, his strength, his uniquely poetic elbows. He even gives the man a signature move, the Theban throttle. You nearly choke on a date pit. Callios notices your expression and grins. "You must have seen it firsthand," he says. "Quite the fighter." You respond with a nod that feels more like a neck injury than an agreement. He takes this as encouragement and plays the chorus again, louder. Birds scatter. Your remaining sandal begins to fray at the edge, as if trying to leap off your foot in protest. Nights are not restful. You sleep under fig trees, beside olive groves, once near a statue of a minor river god, with a chipped nose and a deeply judgmental tilt to its head. You wake up cold, or hot, or confused, sometimes all three. Your dreams are vague and unpleasant, like reenactments of your failures, performed by worse actors. At one point, a donkey attempts to eat your satchel. You let it have the strap. You've lost worse things. As you approach your polis, the air begins to smell more familiar. Dust and thyme, sea salt, and distant disappointment. The city walls don't look particularly welcoming, neither do the goats, or the street children who pause long enough to recognise you, then resume chasing one another with a shout of, "Watch out or he'll fall on you." Charming. You limp past the olive press where you once swore to impress your ancestors. Past the well where you once boasted to the girl with the excellent cheekbones about your training. Past the shop where your cousin once dared you to lift a basket of flour and you pulled something that still hasn't healed. Home. Your mother greets you at the door with a pause long enough to imply concern, followed by a very neutral, "You look thinner." You nod. She nods. No one hugs. She gestures for you to come in, then hands you a bowl of lentils. They are room temperature. So is the affection. Your cousin, who once claimed he could outrun a centaur and once lost to a blind chicken in a foot race, greets you with a smug, "I could have done better." You believe him. You do not say so. You just chew your lentils and imagine what it might feel like to throw him through a pane of parchment. Your father doesn't say much, just grunts when he sees your sling and makes a vague gesture that could mean "good effort," "why bother," or "do you smell figs?" You nod in return. Later, he'll ask how the other men looked. You'll say "very symmetrical." He'll grunt again. That will be the end of it. You are given your old bedroll in the corner of the main room. The goats have been moved, which you take as a compliment. The roof still leaks. The walls still whisper. The neighbours still shout in the morning about things that don't matter. It is, undeniably, home. That night, as the oil lamp sputters and your shoulder begins to throb again, with the dull ache of humiliation, you lie back and consider your Olympic journey. You did not win. You did not impress. You did not so much compete as occupy space near competition, but you went, you tried, you experienced something. You gained a limp, a new respect for trained athletes, and an extremely low tolerance for bards. And as your mother snores in the next room, and a neighbour begins to argue loudly with a chicken, you realise something else. You survived. Not gloriously, not heroically, but thoroughly. And in the grand scheme of Greek history, that might just be the rarest achievement of all. You smile, a little, it hurts, but less than it used to. The sling pulls gently on your neck as you roll onto your side, eyes closing to the familiar creak of wind against shutter. The bard's song fades from memory. The bruises do not. You think of Leon the goat, and this time you don't hiss, just exhale. The journey is over. You are home. It starts innocently enough. A passing neighbour at the well asks, "So how did it go?" You pause, ladle in hand, and say, "Well enough," which is, on a technical level, not a lie. You did survive. You did attend. You even managed to remain conscious through portions of it. The neighbour nods and, satisfied with the answer, moves on to complain about olives again. But something shifts in you. A seed planted somewhere in the shame gland begins to sprout. By the time you're back at the tavern, 3 nights, 2 foot cramps, and 1 argument with a goat later, the story has grown legs. Not strong legs, mind you, but legs capable of creative footwork. You're seated on a cracked stool, cradling a cup of diluted wine, surrounded by the warm flicker of oil lamps and the scent of overcooked lentils, when someone asks you what it was really like. And you begin. You say you competed with honour, that you were in the running for the laurel, but the sun played tricks on your vision, that the pancration match was unfairly paired, that your opponent, a man known only as Leon the goat, stood nearly 7 feet tall and had a forehead like a battering ram. You do not mention the sandals, or the fig tree. The tavern listens, sort of. A few men grunt in recognition. 1 woman laughs at your impression of Leon's bellow. Someone buys you a refill. That's enough to encourage you. The second telling is bolder. You now say you nearly placed in the sprint, that the trumpet blew early, and you weren't quite positioned. You add a limp for emphasis. It's not entirely performative. It just shifts with convenience. You mutter something about a strategic withdrawal and claim you were asked to try the pentathlon, but declined for religious reasons. By the third telling, you're embellishing with confidence. You include crowd reactions, a chant that may not have happened, a young maiden who threw you a laurel sprig for luck. You describe the heat in dramatic tones, the sacred oath with unexpected solemnity, and the way your fig dropped just as the gods intended. The details get hazier with each round of wine, but the rhythm gets smoother. Someone suggests you write it down. You pretend to consider it. Soon you become the local Olympian, not out of accuracy, but out of narrative inertia. The other young men in the village, none of whom have been farther than the next polis over, begin quoting your lines. They adopt your limp when mimicking you, though theirs looks more like a hiccup in the knee than a war wound. You do not correct them. Why would you? Your mother rolls her eyes but serves you dinner without comment. Your cousin stops mocking you, mostly because his recent attempt at cliff diving resulted in the world's least majestic splash, and a bruised ego that still hasn't dried. The bard, yes, Callios the golden-throated, eventually wanders into your polis. You see him before he sees you, perched on a makeshift platform near the main square, tuning his lyre with the smug serenity of a man who thinks he knows everything. You approach warily, prepared for retaliation. Instead he grins. "Ah, the goat breaker," he says loudly, in front of a crowd of children. You smile, weakly. He claims he's added your tale to his repertoire, that the song now includes a dramatic near victory in the Stadion, a misunderstood elbow technique in the pancration, and a final moment of wisdom shared with the judges before your noble withdrawal. You try to protest, quietly, but he waves you off. Art, he says, it improves everything. And so the legend continues. It becomes convenient, really. When the tax collector comes around, you mention your Olympic service and imply a small honorarium is customary. When new visitors arrive, you drop words like disciplined, sacred, and pain threshold into casual conversation. You wear your tunic slightly looser on one side to show the sling-shaped crease in your shoulder. Real or imagined, you no longer distinguish. Children start drawing crude images of a figure running with wild hair and one sandal. You claim it's meant to be you. They say it's their uncle after wine. Either way, you encourage them. One spring, someone paints your name on the side of the local gymnasium. The Olympian, it says. The letters are uneven. The spelling is questionable. But you feel a quiet glow in your chest as you pass it, even as the wind slowly strips the paint from the plaster. It washes off within 2 days. No one redoes it. Still, it happened. Briefly. Like most glory. You don't return to Olympia. You say you've already made your mark. That once is enough. That the games are becoming too political anyway. You say it with a wave of your good hand and a sage expression, as if reflecting on deep philosophical truths rather than a deeply bruised coccyx. Years pass. Your name is still mentioned now and then, mostly when the local boys wrestle and someone says, "Don't pull a goat move." They mean you, sort of. You're proud, sort of. Your stories change with the telling. The wounds deepen or fade depending on the weather. The sprint becomes a tie. The bathhouse incident becomes a misunderstanding. The sacrifice cake becomes a cunning dive for fallen grapes. You stop trying to clarify. There's power in ambiguity. And then one day, you hear a traveller at the tavern ask if anyone here ever competed at Olympia. Someone gestures toward you. You turn, smile, lift your cup, and say, "Only once." They ask how it went. You pause, just for a beat, and then you begin, again. And that brings us to the end of tonight's episode. Not a story of glory exactly, but of pulled muscles, crushed figs, and the unkillable human instinct to spin failure into folklore. If you enjoyed this gentle stumble through ancient history, feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with the next historical regret you'd like to see immortalised. If you'd like early access to more of these quiet descents into forgotten history, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to support the show, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps more people find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chroniclers, Andrew S. and Rich Davis. Sleep well.